My name is Amanda Falk. I use she, her pronouns. I am a partner and chief clinical officer at The Dorm, which is an IOP and PHP treatment community for young adults. And we have locations in both New York City and Washington, D.C. We serve a dynamic and resilient and clinically diverse group of young adults, ages 18 to 30. About 50% of our clients at any given time identify as LGBTQ plus. And today, more than ever, as our LGBTQ plus community is under attack, we believe that providing opportunities and spaces for affirming care is vital. And coming together today to discuss gender affirming care, we are so grateful to have both Beck Gee and Jordan held here with us today. We are going to be exploring what we can do as clinicians to create truly affirming environments by first examining the history of gender affirming care and then the evidence-based practices guiding experts today. So to introduce our presenters, first, I'd like to formally introduce Beck Gee, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Breathe Life Healing Centers. Beck is a seasoned clinician with over 17 years of experience in the mental health and substance use field. He specializes in supporting LGBTQ plus individuals, adolescents, and families through a trauma-informed lens. Beck holds a bachelor's degree in sociology with a focus on gender and sexuality, a master's in addiction counseling from HBFF Graduate School, and a second master's in marriage and family therapy. Joining Beck will be Jordan Held, president and founder of Relentless Pursuit Therapy and Consulting. Jordan is a licensed clinical social worker specializing in trauma recovery, LGBTQ plus care, and complex family dynamics. As president and founder of Relentless Pursuit Therapy and Consulting, he works with young adults transitioning from treatment settings, helping them break harmful patterns, strengthening family systems, and building sustainable paths towards healing. So with all of that said, I would like to hand our presentation over to Beck and Jordan from here.
Amazing. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everyone, for being here today at this hour to talk about this very important topic. It's something that's very near and dear to me and Jordan. Let's see here. Okay, so we went through that, who we are. Unless, Jordan, you want to introduce yourself in any other way?
No, I'm just happy to be here and really grateful that you all took this hour out of your days to spend this time with us.
Amazing. Here's a table of contents. We're going to go through it and we're going to go through. We only have about 45 minutes so we can get questions and answers going, but we'll, a lot of the conversation, like this kind of talk is a lot of dialogue, conversation, and ever changing. And just like a real quick overview, obviously we do a lot of 101 trainings, but it's really important to understand as clinicians our power and privilege in the therapeutic space, in the organizational space of our clients that are coming in who are trans or non-conforming or non-binary, and understanding where we are in this dynamic, and we may have different power, positions of power and different positions of being marginalized in our own individual way, as is our clients. I like to say Jordan and I, on paper would look like the same person, but our life experiences are very different and vast, and we can't just, pigeonhole a clinician or a client and say, oh, well, you're trans, so you should go to this trans therapist or you should go to this person specifically. We really need to look at a person in a holistic way and give them the best opportunity for recovery, for thriving rather than just surviving. Because today a lot of people are, really just kind of trying to survive amongst all of our clients as well. So let's talk a little bit about history. This conversation will talk about the parallels of what we've seen in the past and what we're seeing today as it currently stands. So Jordan will start with his favorite person.
So, if you don't know Magnus Hirschfeld, you should. He was a real pioneer in terms of um, really what it's like to be an ally, what it's like to be an ally to those who are other. Magnus founded the Center for Sexual Science in Berlin in the 1900s. He was an avid researcher. He researched and wrote some of the earliest documentation on working with gender diverse individuals. He himself was a physician. He was a sexologist. He was a person who provided homes for people who were marginalized. And why he is important in the Institute is important is because um, during the kind of Nazi regime, all of the works that he had created, the writing and the research were destroyed. Right. And so oftentimes, even today, when we're hearing about where's the research, where's the evidence, we could track back years, century around where this work first came from and how it originated, and then it was gone, right? But what he stood by, and this quote that is so important to me in my work, and what is on etched into his grave is per scientiam ad justitiam, which translates to through science to justice. And I think now more than ever, that really just like gives me the chills because we've so lost that, right? When we're hearing all of the things, through the media, and a lot of propaganda that is coming up, especially around gender care, we're not focused on all of the science that has existed and continues to exist, right? When we talk about these evidence-based practices, right? We have so veered, right? And so as we're talking about 2025, Beck and I think it's really important to remember where we came from. And this is just a snippet.
So we'll look at, what it looks like today and as it relates to gender affirming care and practices as we're doing them in the moment. Jordan and I have done these talks across the world for many years, and this presentation today, we had to shift and change just as the world as the world turns and shifts, right? And so I'm sure that those of you who are in this session today might be feeling pressures from your clients, pressures from the outside world of like, what do I do? How do I support these clients? How do I show up as a clinician? Maybe some of you are also part of the LGBT community who are experiencing this in real time as well. How do I take care of myself as well as my clients as I'm experiencing this? And so and the fact that it's always changing, and sometimes we can feel like, that we can never catch up to all of the news that's, coming in and all of the changes and shifts that are happening. How do I stay afloat, right? But most importantly is, how do I show up for a client who is in distress, who needs my help, who needs to be heard and seen? So then, right, we're gonna go then and now, right? Just in comparison and parallels, right? Obviously we talked about, the destruction of, thousands upon tens of thousands of works, scientific research on gender affirming care. In the 1930s, we lost all of that. And we're seeing, the books, and it's not just Hirschfeld. Like, we saw works from Einstein that were destroyed. I mean, it was not just gender care. There was a lot of science happening in this institute that were held there. So there, we called, his work was called Degenerate, right? And today we're seeing similar, conversation around, the gender affirming care being seen as child abuse or pseudoscience, and some states have criminalized providers. Some of you are in states that are on this call who are probably in fear of like doing this work, right? Because gender affirming care has been so that term in general has been politicized. I've seen treatment centers remove that from their websites. I've seen clinicians not talk about it as much, right? Jordan, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has really come up a lot lately when it comes to how do we document, how do we code things? What are insurance companies looking for? What are red flags for insurance companies? When a client shows up to treatment and we know that they're trans, are we putting down an F64.4, or are we asking the question of what are you presenting to treatment for, right? Are we assuming that somebody is coming to treatment because they're trans, right? Or are we, meeting the client where they're at, and maybe their gender identity just so happens to be trans male or trans female, but actually they're coming because they're leaving an abusive relationship and they have complex PTSD, right? It's possible that actually, putting down, a certain diagnostic code might not be beneficial at this point, right? Are clinicians actively not wanting to write letters of recommendation for surgeries anymore because they're worried about, folks being litigious? I mean, we could go on just talking about this, but I think it really is relevant to the times. And how are we standing up for these clients? Like, are we pushing back, right? When a parent, wants to have a family session, for example, talking about their child or their young adult and like how to support them, what information are we equipped with versus what are we just kind of taking in from the media and perpetuating, or are we just staying silent? Because that also is complicity, as well. So thinking about the political weaponization of identity, back then, Hirschfeld's era, queer and trans identities were scapegoated as symbols of moral decline, right? And now, I mean, we're there. The amount of trans youths that are used in political messaging, whether it's about bathrooms, sports, healthcare, is astronomical. I mean, a lot of the clients that I see, I mean, these are young people that not only do they not play competitive sports, they are crippled with fear of leaving their houses, school refusal, negative mental health outcomes. And it's not because they're trans. It's because society is telling them that they are not valid, right? That they are not worthy of playing sports, that they are not worthy of taking up space, right? And that's where, if you get one thing from this hour together, it's that being trans is not the problem. It's how society treats trans people that is contributing to what we're seeing with our clients, right? And there's a lot to think about with that, which we don't have time for. But when you're seeing, in the news around just one, headline of trans people should not play in sports, and should not play sports, and this is why, that then it has a trickle down effect to young people thinking that they do not deserve to belong. And we all know, if we're part of the behavioral health field, what a lack of belonging does to a person's mental health.
So for the clinician, right, around right then and now, right, there's a lot of surveillance, a lot of censorship, and we're seeing a lot of educators, clinicians, like I had said earlier, right, around being prosecuted for affirming trans identities, clinicians and educators losing their jobs or their positions or their license. And this can cause, and so for those of you who are in this room who are feeling stuck and feeling in fear, I see you, right? I see you. We all see you here, and understandably so, the fear is great. And how we support that and how we support you is by, standing together, showing up, continuing on. We're going to talk a little bit about advocacy, and I know, it's interesting because sometimes we talk about political, right? And we always think, oh, it's very, polarized, right and left, right? But what we're seeing here is that there are, these conversations around identity and trans identity that is not, it's actually a bipartisan. It's actually a conversation that both sides are having, and that, it's not fully supported on the left, it's not supported on the right and whatnot. So like when we're talking about political, it's more about an overarching concept rather than like, conservative versus liberal. I just want to like state that out loud. It's more about like, how is this conversation being had, and how is it affecting, like Jordan said, this trickle down to our client that is sitting in front of us, that we see in a small town, that is just wanting to like be who they are, right? And wanting to, having these feelings and having these thoughts, and not, and I don't want to like necessarily, I always want to kind of lead with hope, but a lot of our clients, like we said, like isolation leads to substance use, leads to depression, leads to suicidality, self-harm, all of those things that our clients are coming in with. So I just wanted to kind of say that out loud. So when you even saying the word political, it automatically like gives this idea of like, us versus them, which is not, that's not at all what this conversation is about. So go ahead, Jordan.
No, I think we can move it into the advocacy, because I think it's all related. And I want to say, like, we don't want this to be a doom and gloom talk, right? Like, I think it's very easy for this to feel like really heavy and really overwhelming. But the I'll call it the beautiful thing is there are so many people who are working tirelessly every day to get through this and to figure out ways to help people even when larger systems are breaking down, right? And so like that's where the advocacy comes in, right? It's like the organization, the education, each and every one of you that are on this call can and should have a duty to use your circle of people and where you work to continue advocating for change, right? Just I'll give an example. So there's a 99% chance that the press 3 option of 988, the suicide and mental health crisis line that's dedicated specifically to queer and trans young people, that it's going to get defunded. Well, what does that mean? That means that clinicians who do not specialize in working with LGBTQ clients need to get more training, right? We just need to pivot the training to the bigger, broader body of clinicians, admissions departments, marketers in the field to understand how to do this work. So it's not as pigeonholed. Where Beck works, for example, at Breathe, right? It's not a specific LGBTQ plus treatment center, but they all have competencies in working with this population, right? So that's where all of you can come in and being like, what can I do? So as we're even going through this, start thinking about what do you have power over? Is it school boards? Is it contacting local legislators? If you live in a conservative state, what LGBTQ centers, even grassroots organizations, can you volunteer with doing a clothes drive? Even little things can create a big ripple effect in this society.
Yeah. And as we like, have our clients in front of us and we're starting to like refer out, I think that is a conversation too. It's like when my client needs better care or more intensive care, right, than an individual, right? How do I call and make those calls and understand, if this client will be seen, and that their identity will be, affirmed in that space. Like I could call the dorm, I can call Amanda and say, hey, I have a trans client. How do you room them? How many? And I would go even further, right? To saying like, when was your last training with your staff? Right? When did you, and really dive into those conversations, because a lot of times, a lot of places will do a one and done, and they've, seen Jordan and I like 10 years ago talking about this on a YouTube, and it's very different conversation today. And so like, where am I? And if you need help in that, Jordan and I know Amanda, like we have resources to help you, to guide you in that conversation. So just, as we like kind of walk through like the before and after, right? I want to like take us back to 1952, right? Look at the news, take a moment to just look at the page and see what, like, just check in with yourself. What does it look like to you? What are you seeing? How is it represented here? I mean, what is the first thing that you see, right? This was news on, Christine Jorgensen. If you don't know who she is, you can definitely go and Google and understand what happened there. But what I see is actually, a pretty positive, right? Like conversation around gender identity, right? And transition. And this is in 1952. So if I look at that compared to today, right? And I look at and those of you who are know that, who get, who are, have the news coming across your news feed on a regular basis, I'm sure a lot of that feed, and remember that our clients are seeing this feed, right? Our clients are seeing this on a regular basis. We're so attached to our, phones and and everything, especially young people, right? They're seeing this on a regular basis and what that messaging feeds to them, right? And how that affects them on a regular basis. I have to change this slide every single time we do this talk, right? So, 6 months ago it was 400, anti-LGBT bills, right? Today it's 850, right? Or more. And that are being, across the country, being instituted or being brought to the floors. And I just think of like how much time and resources and energy it takes to just hold the line of what the progress that we have already made in this case. And now we're having to like, hold the line to not, go back. So.
Yeah, and I think it's important, like especially for the clinicians on the call, but really for everyone, just because there aren't 850 bills that were passed and enacted, every time there is a bill that someone introduces, that is a little t trauma, right? Every time somebody hears that there is another thing that is wrong about trans people, or maybe it's this, or maybe it's this, that's another little t trauma, right? So when we're talking about young people, right, what we need to think about, and young people, I'm even thinking through like 30, right, at this point in time, based on what we're seeing, developmentally and post COVID, you know, this information that is being taken in is really contributing to the lack of ability for folks to regulate and live their lives. So when folks show up to the dorm, for example, right, and need some of these life skills, so much has been missed because people have genuine fear to exist in this society right now, because people are taking the language of those bills, and even though they never get passed, the language still exists. Like when Trump came out with that executive order, when he first started about trans folks, the hype and panic about like using words like mutilation and all of these things, that then gets internalized as I am different, I am other, I am not worthy, insert negative core belief that you want. After a while, of course, these folks are now needing to go into treatment. And if places don't have, let's call it affirming treatment, and really all that affirming means is, do I meet you where you're at and support you, right? Where do these young people go? So moving into really thinking about like, why do all of these things matter? We'll kind of pivot into that.
So the myth versus fact, right? And we're going to kind of go through some of these in the next like 5-6 minutes is that, the myth is gender affirming care is unsafe, right? And the fact is that gender affirming care is often the life saving, and has been supported by every major medical and mental health association. So again, when we're talking about science and this work, is that it is backed up by every major association. So if I'm getting in my newsfeed that this is, and we were talking prior to this, around a lot of the articles that are being presented on the floors of legislation are actually opinions from the New York Times, right? By journalists who have no backing of science or anything like that. And so who are we listening to, right? Who are we listening to? And it's important, I think, to listen to all sides so we kind of know what's coming in. And how do we decipher? How do we decipher? What kind of articles are we reading? If they're science-based, if they've been debunked, which is, again, like there's a lot of debunked scientific research out there that has been used also. However, the unfortunate reality is people don't have enough either time, energy, or even care to look at these kind of works, right? And the science behind it.
So social media, right? This is a big one, right? This myth that social media is creating a social contagion, quote unquote, that is making young people transition, right? I think the reality and the fact is that, yes, although there is a lot of problematic content for a lot of things, for a lot of young people, the internet has and these spaces have actually been life-saving for folks, right? What we're actually seeing when it comes to folks who are presenting to care and treatment, is, especially in some of these more red conservative states, is that having spaces of safety online is actually a life-saving intervention, right? Especially when everything is getting cut off in their community. And this idea of social contagion has been reportedly debunked. What we are seeing, different than when Beck and I were younger, we didn't have access to, we'll call them like possibility models, right? We didn't have a way to see other trans people in movies, in TV shows, living their life as lawyers. Young people now can see that there is a different way to live. So as well, Beck and I, might have benefited from transitioning when we were younger. We weren't able to access medical transition until we were in our 30s because we didn't know we really could, right? Or there wasn't the ability. And so there's a lot of reasons why certain things are happening, but we have to know that a lot of the things that we are hearing are not necessarily backed up with science, and it's creating narratives now. I do a lot of family work, family therapy, where parents are even now coming to these spaces and really challenging their kids in a way that's not helpful. We love a challenge, right? Not, I think a myth too, I want to get this in before we even forget, is that not every child or young adult that presents as trans is necessarily going to engage and embark on medical intervention. A lot of them don't, right? But just like anything, we have to meet people where they're at and then uncover and unpack like what is happening for them and what are the next best interventions. And it's not an automatic, hey, here's some hormones. Hey, you should get this surgery. That is part of this dialogue regarding every trans person that presents to care wants to medically transition in the same way. That's not how it works.
So let's talk about the quote unquote detransition that most young people who, and Jordan alluded to this, is that I think this idea of detransitioning is quite rare. And I think what we're not talking about here is to the extent of which someone who actually understands, how to work with trans young people, to the extent of the work that goes into this, and to trans people in general. I think that we get this myth that a 7-year-old says that they're trans, and then they walk up to a local Planned Parenthood and they say, give me hormones, and then they get hormones. And that's not how this works. And I think a lot of us who are doing actually this work understand that, but there's been a narrative that has been, kind of put into the media by a lot of very loudly, and has been adopted to being like, this is how it works. And it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work in the way that a lot of people are saying it does. And what we, come to find out is that, affirming someone's gender, or, again, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but, we're clinicians, we're meeting people where they're at. We're not, you know, I mean, affirmation is our job, right? And that doesn't mean that we don't challenge or ask questions or, you know, get curious about someone's identity and what that means to them and where they're at in their life and their world. And, you know, whether it be influences or just understanding or wanting to explore, right? You know, a seasoned clinician who's doing this work can differentiate some of this stuff and have these conversations. The reality is sometimes we're afraid to, you know, say that, like, oh, maybe not everyone is trans, and that's okay, right? It's okay that, you know, people don't want to go through any kind of affirmation surgeries or even hormones for many different reasons. But today, right, a lot of clients that we're seeing don't do it out of fear, right? Because what's going to happen? What's going to happen to me? Am I going to get it taken away from me if I start this journey, right? Or what is my family going to think? Or what, you know, am I going to be able to even travel outside of, you know, my house, really? So I think it's important to say that, like, you know, 1 to 2% of a population that, you know, and that regret is not necessarily not being trans either. We have to dive into that. You know, the regret might be like, gosh, I really wanted to be myself and live in this space, but I can't survive this way.
Well, and it's interesting, you know, to this now too. Um, I work with a mid-20s client on the East Coast who is in a southern state and trans feminine person, and she is very intentionally not changing her documents now, not engaging in some of the medicalization that she wants to do. And quite frankly, at first I was like judging it a little bit, right? And then I had to like just pause for a second, be like, what's coming up for me as a clinician? Like, I want this person to like, let's start hormones, let's do all these things. I want to support you. And then I was like, hold on, I get it. Like, I really understand where this person's coming from. There's a part of them that wants to actually still maintain some of their, let's call it maleness, right? And not start hormones because it's safer for them right now. Right. For them, they don't want to change their documents because they don't want to go to the airport and be seen by a TSA officer as incongruent and it not aligning. And so for them, it's actually more calming to their nervous system to know for herself that she is a woman and that she is, even though she's not going to medicalize right now, she knows who she is and she feels stable in that. That's where I, as the clinician, was actually having feelings of like, come on, let's go, let's do this. We can make you happier. But for her, that felt more stressful, right? And so that's where we need to really zoom out on why our clients choosing things. And sometimes it's because they're incredibly resilient and resourceful and they know how to code switch, right? So this person is going to go and be with some of her community and wear what she wants to wear and maybe shave more than she would outside. And who am I to judge, right? This is actually super adaptive for this person.
So how do we support our clients? Right. And I mean, obviously we've been talking about that, you know, throughout this, but I think it's important to, like, you know, understand that, you know, elevated risk of mental health issues are going up, right? Amongst all of our trans clients, you know, suicidality, especially the clients that we work with, I think in clinical, you know, in institutions, things like that. Obviously it's probably higher than 50%. It's probably more, you know, upwards of, I mean, most of my clients that I work with have attempted at least once in their life. And you know, a lot of this comes from, right, the minority stress model, which a lot of us are understand and know. But that it's also, you know, this internalized transphobia, this low self-esteem, this, you know, these trauma responses. And again, like this chronic stress. It feels like it's never ending at this point in time. There's no breaks, and no breaks has come with, the arrival of the iPhone, right? Right. Where there's like no breaks. These kids have been bullied their whole life, and now they're being bullied by, they're, adults, and they're bullied by the systems and that they live under, the institutions that they try to go to school under, and then the governments that are, that are trying to change, their the way that they live, and then the way that they want to live, and make decisions for themselves, and having body autonomy. We talk a lot about trans youth and, parental rights and things like that, but, a lot of these laws and stuff are now, we saw it happen very quickly where it said, someone who is 19 and under, right? And 18, at 18 years old, you're considered an adult. 18, you're considered, you can go into the military, you can do a lot of things, you can vote, you can do a lot of things. But then they change it to 19 around gender affirming care in some states. And that was the window that opened up this idea that now we're going to start taking away body autonomy and rights away from adults making these decisions about themselves.
And so really thinking about, how the barriers to affirming care exacerbate distress, right? I mean, we know, this is what we know. This is backed by science, by fact, right? Access to gender affirming care, right? Lowers suicidality, improves mood and self-image, improves better overall functioning, improves a person's ability to live and to hopefully thrive, right? And we also know what happens when things are taken away, right? And so, I think it's important for folks to really understand too that there are so many paths to affirming someone. And I'll reiterate it again, because this is what continues to come up in the work, is being supportive is not necessarily signing on the dotted line for a young person to access medical care, right? There are lots of different ways to support someone's gender journey, right? What you all need to do is be able to ask more questions, right? To be able to dive into, all of the different elements of somebody's identity and find, where the distress lies, right? Not every trans person chooses to medically transition, right? But what we need to do is not assume certain things. We, as the clinicians or people who work in treatment, need to be the ones that folks trust. But unfortunately, I have worked with clients, as has Beck, where they have gone to upwards of 10 treatment centers or outpatient clinicians and have been harmed by people who actively deny their identity, right? And that has nothing to do with hormones, surgeries, blockers, etc. It purely has to do with, meeting them where they're at, which should be the low bar for us at this point.
So what do we do next as we start to kind of come to a close here, and gonna answer some questions that I see happening in the Q&A. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in now. We'll try to get to a lot of them. But showing up, right? Showing up is really, just as Jordan said, is it's amazing what we can do when we just show up and listen and see and hear and get curious and, ask questions, and rather than just, dismissing. And I know it's hard to say that to a group of clinicians, right? To say oh, don't be dismissive. And but what we do hear a lot from clients over the years is that, they've gone through many clinicians who have dismissed, their identities, or have not been able to be honest about who they were, because our clients are checking us out and testing us as much as, we're trying to understand them. So we have to be, really aware around who, you know, how we're showing up for a client, how, are we listening to them? Are we showing, and also like Jordan gave the example of his client, about, wanting to like almost like not necessarily force, but be like, there's a pathway for you, right? Like we want to like, champion trans rights and stuff like that. But like even that can cause anxiety. So we need to step back, even in our advocacy sometimes to like, because I've done that as well, where, I've had a client early on and I've said, they would come into my office and dress, and come to IOP and change their clothes and then live, a different life outside of IOP. But for that moment, for that like 9 hours a week, they were like exactly who they were and allowed to be. And I tried to, kind of say, you can do this all the time. And she was like, I can't do that all the time. I will lose my job. I will lose my family. I will lose, and so like if I can offer that space for just those moments, those pockets of safety for someone to um be like let their guard down and just be who they are, like that's the service I want to provide, right? I don't need to provide, a diagnosis. I don't need to provide, unless like I'm having a conversation with a client and saying like, will this be supportive and helpful for you going forward to move forward through any affirming care that you might need medically. But I can just sit and be with that client and show up for them in that way. And their journey is their own. Their journey is their own, and I'm just here to be a facilitator of the conversation, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
I want to really, I think this is important. I'm seeing in the chat a comment about making references to scientific studies, but only discussing our politics. I'm going to call it out. Like, here's the thing. When politics gets involved, when people in who hold positions of power in political systems are taking away somebody's ability to live, right? So when somebody takes away my ability to go to the pharmacy and get my medication, that becomes political, right? And I think this is where things have really become so polarized in our country, is that nothing about somebody's identity, if I should be a political thing. That's correct. But when access to care, access to housing, access to employment, access to safety gets taken away because of a political decision, then we have to talk about politics, right? And we don't have a lot of time to get into it, but I do think that it is a really important thing for folks to wrap their heads around, because we don't want to be talking about politics, right? Trans people actually just want to be able to exist, but things have become politicized, right? Um, I don't know, Beck, if you want to, speak about that, or if we want to just move through it. I saw it and I had to pay
No,
attention.
of course. I think it is really important. And there's this conversation of the CAS um research that the UK actually took on to cancel out hormone like gender affirming care for young people. And again, a lot of these scientific research has been debunked and not taken by all the other major medical associations and psychiatric associations. I think what we're talking about here is like Jordan said, we don't want it, we talk about identity politics and things like that. And ideally, like we just want to live, right? I think that our clients just want to live and walk through their life, and be able to have autonomy over their bodies, just as, because what we're also not talking about is gender affirming care is not just for trans people. Gender affirming care happens across the board for cisgender people as well, right? Any kind of, um, I don't know, hair transplants, Viagra, right? Like there's a lot of gender affirming things out there that are not trans specific. Um, But what has happened is that trans people have become a political pawn. And the reality is that when a small percentage of marginalized people become a political pawn, therefore, what we're seeing with our clients that are coming in is the effects of that. And their deteriorated mental health, their deteriorated, their want to you know, isolate and not be a part of this world, right? Because they're told they're not allowed to be part of this world. And
Right.
that
And this
is,
idea, and I want to, if folks want science, so I'm seeing in here, right, the continuation. And, if you have, if there are, obviously there are some feelings about, what we're saying, which is fine. That's why we do these talks. Reach out to us. Let's talk about it. There's tons of science. If you want lots of articles, we can, we can send those your way. The World Professional Association of Trans Health has the standards of care. It's a 300-page standard of how this work should be done, right? There are there's a myriad of science, right, that has been put out there, and unfortunately a lot of it is getting cut right now, right, by the NIH funding. But I think this really speaks to, even within the field, we're very hyper focused on this idea of medicalization. Just Google WPATH standards of care and the PDF will come up. It's a good read for folks. And it's actually a pretty, what we would call in the field, it's a little bit gatekeepery, right? It's very conservative. It's very, broken up into how to best provide care. And there's a lot of obstacles that people have to go through, right? And that's to protect everyone. Right. But I think once again, people are jumping into this is about changing people's bodies medically. What we are talking about is how to support somebody's identity. Just like if you had someone that was coming into your office who was undocumented or who was Black or who was not able-bodied, right? That's what we're talking about. We're not even talking about access for minors to have surgeries. But that's where people hear trans care and their mind automatically goes to that.
yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm just getting caught up in the chat, but I think it's really important to just is how are we showing up? How are we showing up for our clients? Are we a container of safety, or are we a container of dismissiveness to our clients, right? And ideally, I do hope for the best for most clinicians to be a container of safety so that their clients can survive and thrive in this world. And we want the best for them. I do want to recognize the time at 10:50, so I want to get into some Q&A here. I will probably stop my share, so then it's just us on the screen, if that's okay, Amanda.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can help sort of, there's a bunch of, I know there's a lot going on in the chat right now. And I just want to sort of reiterate that, the purpose of this webinar is to talk about gender affirming care and how we as clinicians can provide affirming spaces and affirming interventions, not to debate its existence. If you want that type of webinar, those exist out there, and you should definitely feel free to attend those, but that's not what we're doing here today. With that said, I think there are some important questions that came in, especially when you're dealing with family members of young people. We've had a bunch of questions come in where, how do we deal with parents of minors or even not of minors? Because let's face it, when you're 20, 21, 22, 23, 28 years old, many people are still very much dependent upon their families, and how do we work with those family systems? Any suggestions or comments about that?
Go ahead. I was just catching up on the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we just need to pause and kind of take a step back, and really, you know, Amanda, I love what you said just before. It's like, how do we get into the space right now where like we're just fighting about things that are so beyond the point of what, you know, what we're seeing in our offices. Like when clients and families come into our offices or into our facilities, there are so many things that are going on. And I think that the most important thing that we can do is really understand like where each individual is coming from in their environment, right? And what are their needs, right? Sometimes we get in the weeds about medicalization and hormones and access, and really all someone is looking for is to be heard, right? And, you know, I worry about our field, and I'm going off topic. I worry about our field because I see how many young people are harmed, especially in rural environments with a lack of access to folks who understand LGBTQ issues. And our role is not to challenge people, right? Like, that's not what therapy is, right? We don't go into a space and say, well, are you sure about that? We can say, tell us about that. And do you want feedback or what support do you need? But actively saying, like, you don't exist or that's not accurate or have, or like, that's where we're overstepping. And so I just want to, in the last few minutes, really ask folks if you're having feelings come up, please reach out. Like these are the conversations we like happening, we like to have, but don't just like end this and be like, okay, I'm going to go on my way. If you have feelings about it, keep talking about them because your feelings are going to show up with your clients. And that is exactly why folks are at such an increased risk of suicidality, getting murdered, depression, anxiety, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, it's you know, like I said, I was like kind of catching up on the chat, and I know people like chiming in, and like I think there's a lot of passion here, there's a lot of support here, there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of like also, you know, people kind of stepping in and being like, I don't understand this. This is, I'm questioning this, and is this okay, right? And as a clinician, we have to do that. And I think, you know, but I also think, right, like Jordan said, is like, what is our job? What is our scope and what do we get into doing this work for? And the work that we do is really valuable, I believe. And it is very, you know, working in the mental health field, you know, we have to be very aware that we can cause damage. We can cause significant damage if we're not, like, if we don't understand, if we're not seeking supervision, if we're not showing up and getting trained ourselves more and more, and understanding, and again understanding what the world is today, presently, right now, because our clients are coming in with a present moment and whatever it is. And again, like we talked about, it could not be it, we could have, I could have plenty of trans people coming in and being trans is not what they're wanting to talk about. Right? They want to talk about their relationships. They want to talk about all of that. And so I'm gonna be with them right where they at, right where they are, right in that moment. And that is my job, is to show up for them in that moment with what they're bringing to the table, not, you know, ask, you know, uh, not having to necessarily, and not challenging, but like Jordan said, being curious and showing up.
Yeah. There was something in the chat that I think is helpful or important just to touch on really briefly about timelines, especially when folks are presenting to treatment with significant mental health struggles, maybe outside of their gender dysphoria, and how to go about kind of timelines with then medical transition. That's where I would make sure that someone, your client, is get hooked up and gets a consultation with someone at your local gender clinic so that you can work kind of in conjunction Obviously, no one should make any big decisions when they're in the middle of a crisis, right? But once someone gets stabilized, I think oftentimes treatment is a really beautiful time to work in conjunction with another team in a multidisciplinary way to get a consultation at a gender clinic, understand what's going on. It's very important for people to realize you don't just walk into a gender clinic and get a service, right? There is an entire process that happens leading up to it, even for adults, right? But oftentimes we hear you should not start gender affirming care while you're still in treatment. Not necessarily. That's a fully individualized experience based on what's coming up for somebody and what their needs are. So that's going to need to be more of a deep dive.
And I just want to say, if you want to look up, I'm putting it in the chat here. If you like to watch TV shows on Netflix, there's a documentary about Magnus Hirschfeld and the Sexual Science Institute called El Dorado, Everything the Nazis Hate. And it talks all about the history of Magnus Hirschfeld, and it came out about 1.5 years ago. It's really wonderful. Highly suggest it.
Thank you both so much for your time and your patience and your grace and your education and all of it. Really powerful. I can see the gratitude coming out in the chat as well. So thank you. We look forward to continuing this important conversation and doing more of these as we have been doing. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. Continue the conversations in your small, the person next to you, have this conversation. I think that's really where we need to be. Because sometimes it can feel overwhelming, but if I can talk to the person across the table from me, to my family, to my friends, to people who may not understand, like that's how we show up. So thanks for having us today.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Right.